You're listening to Art Affairs, episode 96. Today I'll be talking to Travis Lampe. Alright, so my name is Michael Faith, and this is Art Affairs. Art Affairs is my attempt at shining a spotlight on the many wonderful people that make up this amazing art community, featuring conversations with artists, gallerists, curators, telling their stories. You can dig through previous episodes, complete with show notes, at artaffairs.podcast.com, but the best way to stay plugged in is to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify specifically, don't forget to give the show a rating. And if you're really enjoying the show and want to help support what I'm doing here in an even bigger way, check out the Art Affairs Patreon. Not only does it give you an opportunity to help keep the show going, but there are several community-oriented benefits as well, like getting early access to episodes and suggesting questions for upcoming guests. You can find all the information about that at patreon.com/artaffairs. You can also connect with the show on Instagram at Art Affairs Podcast. All right, so today's guest is artist Travis Lampe. Travis creates humorous and playful paintings that have a very old-school cartoon look to them. We talk about his early love of old Disney cartoons on the show, how he first started to explore his own artistic style while working full-time as an art director in an advertising agency, as well as the value of keeping a day job alongside his personal art practice, and a whole lot more. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Travis Lampe. Travis, welcome to the show, man. It's really good to have you on.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on your show, your art show.
All right. So let's dive into your background a little bit. And I know that you were born and kind of grew up in a small town in Kansas.
That's
but
right.
I wasn't sure like what part of Kansas and like what that area was like when you were growing up.
Imagine the flattest, most kind of unadorned landscape you can imagine, right? Did you ever see the movie Dances with Wolves 500 million years ago?
It was probably that long ago when I saw it.
Yeah, so when they're out in the plains and they're getting ready to ride into, to go claim land or whatever, and it's just blue sky all around, grasslands and all that. That's where I grew up. We were about 5 hours away from anywhere.
Wow.
That any kind of city. I think I believe the closest city was Colorado Springs, and that was a good 5-hour drive at the time because the speed limits were lower back then. Okay. So very, very rural, all farming, cattle, and wheat, corn, stuff like that.
Is that what your parents did? Were they into farming?
Yeah, well, my dad actually, he was a salesman actually for a long time when I was young. My stepdad does do farming still. But yeah, they live on a farm, so it's pretty legit. It's kind of the legit experience.
And then they still live out in kind of the plains of Kansas? Okay.
Yeah, it's tough to get out there because if you want to visit, you have to drive, you have to fly somewhere bigger.
Right.
And then drive for 6 hours or 5 hours or whatever it is. So it's kind of tricky to get out there. It's remote.
Right on. And so like, how did you get exposure to the arts initially? Like what was your like initial spark that got you interested in art?
So my grandfather was he was kind of a happy tree style painter,
Bob Ross.
Bob Ross. That's right. I told you I had trouble with names, but the most famous painter of all time,
right?
That guy. He was kind of a Bob Ross style painter, and he had these big sketch pads, and he would, to entertain us, I think, or to keep us busy when he was watching us, at times when we were kids, he would give us art lessons, right? Show us little perspective lessons and stuff. And that got me interested. And I think I was the one of the grandkids who kind of showed a real interest and kind of aptitude in that. So he definitely got me into it, taught me some tricks and stuff like that. But then there was I actually I've never been the kind of person to be bored and just like sit down and do art. I never have been like that. I'll sketch for 5 minutes and then be bored of it, which is kind of a weird quality for an artist. But so it wasn't just art for art, but I did, when I was a kid, they had Disney had a 50-year, I want to say it was a 50-year anniversary, right? Or like some sort of a festival they were doing. And as part of that, we used to go to matinees in my small town. They had a little theater there, and we would go to the matinees and see whatever they were playing. But for this special event, they had this 50th anniversary where they were showing cartoons from every era. And that was the first time I ever saw one of those old Mickey Mouse cartoons, like the Steamboat Willie, that kind of stuff. And man, that was like getting hit with a lightning bolt, or just somebody flipped a switch. Like I immediately was confused as to why they ever changed the style from that old style, because it spoke to me. And from then on, I was probably 7 years old or so. And from then on, that was the aesthetic that was like stuck in my head. That was my kind of ideal, I guess. And so, from there, it was just sketching here and there randomly, but I would always try to emulate that kind of noodle arm style, I guess.
So like from a skill perspective, you were kind of taking inspiration from your grandfather, and then from like a subject perspective, it was a lot of these older cartoons.
Yeah. And I think it was a combination of those things. I don't imagine that if I had never encountered, those cartoons, I don't think I probably would have gotten into art.
Wow. So like looking back around that time, was it something that you took seriously as like, what you want to be when you grow up? Like when somebody asked you, what do you want to be? Or were you wanting to be something else?
No, okay. Not at all. I guess that would have always been a dream. I never really thought I would be an artist when I was young, right? Because, that's a pretty conservative atmosphere out there in rural Kansas. And, people are just more, I think, a little more common sense, or at least how they define themselves, a little more down to earth, common sense, keep your goals realistic and all that. And it was just always understood that I would have a real job, and then, I could just do art as a hobby. But that did change later. At one point I thought, I'll be an illustrator. But back then it was like, no, I thought I was going to be an architect. Oh, okay. And I got almost all the way done with the high school courses in architecture, and I realized that you had to do math, right. And you had to do boring, like ordering materials and stuff. And I was just like, this is not for me. I don't want to do this. But then my art teacher in high school, who was Mr. Mann, he was the best. He kind of steered me towards graphic design, and that was practical enough that I thought, okay, I could do that as a job, still make some money, but I'm kind of using my art talent, I guess.
What was it about you and that experience that he encouraged you to pivot in that way?
I think just because he saw that I had art potential, but he also, like everyone else, was a kind of a realist in the sense of, he wasn't going to send me out, or he wasn't going to encourage me to go out and just be an artist,
right? Have some angry parents like knocking on his door.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, he was trying to give me like a solid base, and I think it was the right move for me, because I don't know. I still have a regular day job, right? And I've encountered other artists over the years who also do. And there was a point at the beginning of my kind of current art career where I thought, I'll just I'll just be an artist. But then I talked to some people and they were like, you know what?
Yeah.
You may want to think about keeping your day job because it gets pretty rough.
Right.
Pretty rough out there.
Not even, I mean, that's part of it. But like, I've had a few people on that have expressed that same feeling. And it's not as much like I really need this so much as it frees me to really take risks and do things that I wouldn't necessarily feel confident enough to do because my art pays my bills, you know?
Absolutely. And it changes the dynamic of what you're doing, right? I am not good at painting under duress or doing art under duress, right? If I'm stressed out, it affects my performance, you know, my ability. And I really do have a lot of admiration for artists who can do it and who are kind of thrive on that, you know, the tension of that, I guess. You know, creating because they have to create. I'm also not that kind of person. I don't have a deep need to create like a storybook need to create art, you know. I do love the finished product, right? But, you know, getting there it's a slog just like anything else, but to go back to, you know, if you're doing that as your only means of funding, I don't know, it takes the joy out of it for me. So
that makes sense. So like looking back, were your parents supportive of that trajectory for you? I mean, you said that they were more common sense, wanted you to get a quote unquote real job. Were they okay with the graphic design path?
They were good with graphic design because that was sellable to them. You know what I mean? I can get an actual job for a company and make real money, you know, decent money, or at least enough to live on. So I think they were fine with that. I think if I had gone to them and said I was going to just be a painter, don't think they would have gone for that too well. They might have fallen for illustrator.
Fallen for?
That sounds more, yeah. It sounds more official, I guess, or reasonable.
Right. Right on. And so you ultimately went to Fort Hays State University to study graphic design. What led you there specifically? What was it about that school that attracted you?
Mr. Mann, my high school art teacher, he basically, I was, you know, hemming and hawing about where I was going to go to school. And I was looking at Arizona. They had a good art program, or, you know, good graphic design program somewhere down there did. I forget. I think somewhere in Texas had a place. But Fort Hays State was only an hour and a half from my home.
Nice.
And they had kind of 2 degrees there that were kind of the specialties of that school: graphic design, nursing was the other one, and agriculture. So I guess 3. There was 3. Those were the big things they were really good at. They had this guy, Chaiwat Tumsujarat, who was the graphic design teacher. From Thailand. He was really, really good. And so, I mean, essentially, like I got a really good education in graphic design for $0, basically.
Really?
It was really cheap. In fact, I got some sort of a scholarship, like a very, very laughably small scholarship, but it still paid for everything, you know? So
that's cool.
Worked out great. I like not having debt.
I mean, that's the other thing about like when people ask, you know, should I or should I not go to art school? There's always that unsaid kind of worry of having the bills to pay afterwards, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I'm sure that I started a couple steps back from people who went to art school and, you know, had a more intensive training, but I don't know, man. I'm doing just fine.
Right.
And I didn't have a bunch of bills to pay, you know, so I kind of feel like I did it right, at least for me. Some people, it might not be the right path, but.
And so going into that program, that graphic design program, what did you imagine like your career would be? What were you shooting for as far as a job after school?
I started out thinking I would just be a graphic designer, right? And then, or, you know, just, I don't know, working in Chicago or Kansas City or something. And as time went on, I got less enamored of that path. And by the end of college, I thought, well, I'll be an illustrator, right? Like, because it became pretty evident throughout my graphic design career in college that I leaned really heavily on the illustration side of it. In fact, I hated kerning, working with type. Like I was just like, ugh. And I actually got, and computers, you have to understand, computers were very slow back then, right? So if you were trying to do a design working on the computer, especially in Photoshop or whatever, if you moved something 1 pixel, you had to wait about 10 minutes for it to re-render. Wow. And it was bananas. Like you'd have before a final, or before any project was due in the class, people would be in the computer room, because we didn't have our own computers. They'd be in the computer room all night long. And I was like, I'm not having any of that. So I did all of my projects illustration style, but on photocopiers. So I would go just get different colors of paper and photocopy the different elements that I had hand drawn, and then put stuff together. It worked out pretty well. But nice. So I thought I would be an illustrator, but we didn't have an illustration program there. And so I didn't really have a realistic idea in my head of what it would take to be an illustrator. So that's a whole thing too. I don't know. I wish they'd had art business courses there.
Yeah. And I guess, that just to pivot a little bit, that is one thing I hear a lot, regardless of the school. So I don't think this is exclusive to Fort Hays. I think it's just the general state of art school not doing a ton to prepare people for the business side of making art. Yeah. So I don't think that's a exclusively the school that you went to issue so much as just something that needs to be considered in the curriculum a bit more overall. But I guess, did you have opportunities to explore other types of creative expression like painting and drawing while you were there studying graphic design?
Oh yeah, there was, they had, as part of the graphic design trajectory, we had to do, all the regular art courses, which I was happy. I enjoyed them quite a lot. Like I did, painting classes and, the drawing classes, printmaking, all that kind of stuff, which I do really love that stuff. I remember asking the painting teacher one night, I was there late working on something, and asked her if she thought I should change my major to painting. And she really hesitated, because I think, your options at that point are do you intend to be a painting teacher? Because that's probably what you're going to end up doing if you have painting as a major. So she encouraged me to stick it out with the graphic design.
Once you graduated school, from what I understand, you went to Chicago, which I'm not super great with Midwest geography. Sounds like Colorado Springs, which is where my aunt is from. So I don't know why I would have messed that up. But Colorado Springs was the closer area. Why Chicago? Like, what led you to Chicago from Midwest Kansas?
Okay. So I this is a great segue from what we were talking about last. Because I had thought, I'm going to be an illustrator, right? But I hadn't really thought about what I would need to do to make that happen. And I found myself graduating. I had previously, like a month before, they had a graphic design competition, I guess, or I don't know what you call it. I forget what the organization is, but it was a graphic design competition, and I had won the competition. And my friend, who had already graduated and moved up to Chicago, he was working at an ad agency. He brought one of their recruiters down just to go to this competition, and she was there, and I won this graphic design competition, and they offered me a job in advertising. Wow. I had vowed I would not be in advertising because I thought it was stupid, and for all the reasons that any artist would advertising, that's cheap and awful and whatever. And then she said an amount of money that I would be working for, which is laughably small if you think about it now, but at the time seemed like all the money in the world. And I thought, maybe I could do advertising for a little bit until I get going on my illustration career.
It's almost like an old sitcom where it's like ha 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 advertising, and they slide the check across the desk. And you're like, okay, maybe advertising.
It was exactly like that. There was a moment because I was on the phone with her and she said this number, and I thought for a second, and it was just the same beats as the sitcom. Yeah, and I was like, yes, I will take that job. So I moved to Chicago right out of school, and I've lived here ever since. Well, that's not true. I've had some interludes. I did live in Europe a little bit, a couple of years in there for work. I went over there to do advertising in Warsaw, Poland. Okay. But otherwise, I've lived here in Chicago since.
Interesting. And so right out of school, you jumped right into advertising as, I believe, an art director. Yep. And I don't know if that was the case initially or if it was something you kind of worked up to.
No, they started me right out. I never worked as a designer ever.
Okay.
Obviously the company had designers, but they just offered me a job as an art director straight out. And I think it might be because one of my big projects in school was I had written a children's book, right? Mm. It never got published or anything, but I think they thought, oh, he's got storytelling ability, and so they gave me this job. I had no idea what I was doing. I was a very bad art director for several years. So as an art director, a brand new to the industry art director, what was the kind of what kind of projects were you working on? What was the nature of the work? I was working on the most awful Kellogg's projects. The group I was in was Kellogg's. I think they just thought, oh, he does characters. This will be, he'll be perfect here, working with all these little characters. We had Kellogg's, and my group also at the time had Keebler with the elves.
Sure, yeah.
First project I ever worked on was a print ad for Keebler, and I remember the people in the group were very impressed that when I sketched out my idea for what the print ad would be, I was able to draw the elves as they looked, right? And everybody was very impressed with that. But then they explained to me, I had the elves doing like funny stuff, or whatever, like action stuff, right? Like running on top of a cookie or whatever it was. I don't remember, but and they said, oh, the elves don't do any actions. You can only draw them just standing there. And that was my first introduction to how dumb advertising is. But other than that, I worked on really there's got to be some, okay. There was this one project I worked on. It was like business to business. It was Kellogg's trying to convince grocery stores to stock their products on certain shelves. Okay. So I was doing ads from Kellogg's to other businesses just the most boring stuff you can ever imagine in your life.
Shelf 3 is better than shelf 4 because Trick says so.
It's called category management. And it took me about 3 weeks to even understand what that meant, what those words meant.
So that's exciting.
I was working on stuff like that. It wasn't until about 3 years in that I actually did some fun stuff. I worked on an Eggo ad. I think that was my first big ad that I ever did. It was pretty funny.
And so was this an agency that serviced several different types of clients, or was it like the marketing department of Kellogg's?
Oh, no, it was an agency. It wasn't a client. It was Leo Burnett in Chicago. They're pretty big. One of the bigger ad agencies.
Nice. And so while you were doing all of this, full-time advertising work, were you able to, put any time towards your own personal creative practice?
Well, I kind of, for a while, because I was so lost in advertising, I just focused on that and tried to figure out what I was doing with advertising. So I kind of put the whole art thing on hold for a while. And it wasn't until, I want to say 2001-ish, when I was working over in Warsaw, Poland, doing advertising over there, that I thought, you know what, I think I want to give a try to just do an illustration, right? I would get the art magazines or whatever, illustration annuals and stuff like that, and see the stuff, and I would think like, I can do that. I can do. I was wrong. I couldn't do that. It took me many years after that to like, get my style down. I didn't have a style yet, so that's number one. And so it took a while from that point. And I would say I didn't really get going on actual illustration or art until about 2007, I think was my first show. Okay.
And so how did you work from that point of not having a style, having the desire, but not necessarily having identified your own, aesthetic yet, to the point in 2007 where you were actually ready to start showing? How did that evolution in between take place?
There was kind of a progression, right? It was kind of an evolution, I guess. So I was working on Pop-Tarts.
Okay.
They left me in charge of doing the back of the box, and they were like, put some fun activity on there or whatever. So I came up with this idea, and I wanted to get Gary Baseman to illustrate it. He was kind of my illustration hero, and I was like, so I did this sketch, and because I knew I was going to be talking to him about it the next day, I was going to be walking him through what I was thinking. I spent a lot of time on this sketch and made sure that it looked good. Still, it wasn't in my current style. It was kind of a generic style, I guess. But so sure enough, I get on the phone with him the next day, and we ended up talking for about an hour and a half. A call that should have been like 10 minutes. We ended up talking for like an hour and a half, and he was trying to convince me that I should quit advertising and just be an illustrator. And he gave me so much great advice, right? And he basically walked me through all of the basic stuff you would want to know to get started, right? Like, about limiting your color palette and getting a distinctive style that nobody else is doing. He gave me some really practical advice too that I actually do think is helpful. It's kind of it's not true artist mentality, but he gave me this advice, which I still to this day think is genius. And that is, if you're doing your art, don't just do like the idea that it just comes from your heart and it's your expression of yourself is great if everybody likes that. But if you do art that comes from your heart and nobody buys it, there's kind of no point, right? Like if you're actually trying to support yourself. So his big advice in that arena was find a style that you love to do that other people also love, right? It can't just be pure art, right? You're making a product for people, basically. Even if you're doing just, in my opinion, and some people would disagree with this, I'm sure, even if you're just doing regular gallery art, I think, if you make to you beautiful pieces and nobody buys them, you're not going to last very long, right? So there is an art to finding where that Venn diagram overlaps, I would say. But yeah, that was kind of the start, that advice from him.
And once you kind of had that conversation and started to lean more into your personal practice, was it hard to make time for both? Like having a full-time advertising job, I guess you were in Poland originally and then moved back to Chicago. How did you split your time between your personal practice that was kind of fledgling and this, early stage thing that you were trying to get on its feet and also working the day job?
Yeah, I mean, it worked. It actually worked out kind of perfectly because when I came back from Poland, I didn't come back to the same company. I decided I was just going to do freelance, right? So I naively decided I was just going to do freelance. It did end up working out, but it was really, it was rough to get that started, right? You got to develop you got to get all your clients and whatever. So essentially what I was doing during that, there was like a 10-year period where I really truly started developing my art. And that would have started in like the end of 2003 for like 10 years. That's when I was kind of really like trying to get going with the art stuff. But because I was freelancing, I wasn't working every day, right? I would work, I don't know if you have ever done any freelancing, but you make a lot of money in a very short period of time. And then the big stress is, where's my next job, right? As soon as you're done, you're wondering where your next job's coming from. So there was a lot of, I made great money, but there was a lot of downtime. And so in that downtime, I would go looking for jobs, but then in all of my free time there, I would be painting, trying to develop my style. So it kind of worked out like that. And I want to say it was 2007 that I finally got my first, by then I had my style kind of figured out. And that was a very conscious decision, right? I think because of this conversation I'd had with Gary, I really sat down one day in 2004, and in one day I figured out what my color palette was.
Wow.
And I drew this nose, which is kind of a trademark of my stuff, I guess, this light switch nose, because I, up to that point, had hated the noses, right? Like I always thought I would get to the part putting a nose on a character and thought it ruined it. It made it look stupid. And I finally landed on this one and I liked it. And I was like, that's my style. Like that, there was a very distinct moment. I was like, okay, that's my style.
Nice.
Just put a nose on it. I'll fool them all. Right? I'll just paint a bunch of crap and then I'll put a nose on it. Everyone will be fooled by this. But then I found as far as the color goes, I found it was a book that had old products in it. And one of them was like an old Chemi soap package from like the 1920s. And I was like, okay, that's my color palette. I'm just going to stick to that. Very, very limited. I think I had four main colors that I would use, and I would mix them from primary colors. Right. So I've since relaxed a little bit on that because I've realized like, oh, somebody's already mixed some of those colors for you.
Right.
You can shortcut that a little bit. But I was very intent at the beginning to like do everything myself, mix all my colors myself, have my, but it kind of worked because I kind of developed a combination of colors that was somehow personal to me. Yeah, but it was very deliberate, all that stuff.
And so that 2007 time period that we keep coming back to, how did you come on the scene, so to speak, and start getting your work noticed by galleries and start making some of those relationships?
So, yeah, that's been long enough ago that I think I'm messing up some of the details. But there were several different kind of events that happened in there. So my first art show, my first gallery show was, I literally just got a call one day from a gallery owner for a gallery that in Chicago here, that it doesn't exist anymore. And I'm going to tell you the name of that gallery eventually, but it's not in my brain right now. But this gallery owner just called me up and asked if I wanted to do a show with Ryan Heshka. And I didn't know who Ryan Heshka was. I had to go look up his stuff. But the way that had happened was Ryan was going to do a show in Chicago at this gallery, DVA Gallery. That's what it was called.
Okay.
And he was going to do a show in this gallery, but he didn't want to do a full show. He only wanted to paint enough stuff for half a show. Like that was the time that he had. So he wanted to look for somebody to do like a 2-man show with. And how he made that decision, I later found out, is he looked through an illustration annual that I had that year. I had some posters in there that I had done. And he saw that and saw that I was from Chicago, and then asked the gallery owner if maybe I could do a show with that guy. Well, I had never done a gallery anything before. Right. So this guy calls me up, Dave, he calls me up and from the DVA gallery, and he asked me if I wanted to do a show. And I was just like, yeah, sure. I would love to do that. And, got all the details, got off the phone and thought, now I got to figure out what the heck I am doing. Right. Like how do you even do this? And it was trial by fire for sure. But it was really a fantastic experience though. 'Cause first of all, I got, I'm still friends with Ryan. He's one of my one of my favorite artists. I just love his style. He's a true artist, right? He's one of those people I admire because he really does that and that alone. Yeah, it's funny because I found out something else from that show, that first show. It was called Jolly Glee Time, and Ryan and I came up with that name together. It was called Jolly Glee Time, and we both we themed it around this like an old like a defunct kind of Disney-esque company that was that had totally failed, right? This was a fictional company that we invented that had tried to make all these cartoons like back in the 20s or 30s and had totally failed. And so we made paintings that were kind of based on that, like characters that would be in their menagerie or whatever. So that was really fun. But one thing I found out after that show is that other galleries would go through and see who was showing where, what shows were opening. And then if they saw something they thought was interesting, they would invite you to be in a group show. So I started getting, that show was pretty successful. I sold a bunch of pieces and I think there were a lot of people who wondered who the hell I was, right? Because I just all of a sudden was there, right? And they had never heard of me before. And so there was a little bit of, new guy with some potential energy going on. And so I got, oh my God, if I look back at my files now, I still have all those, scans from those shows. I must have been in 30 different group shows that year, and the next year, like just tons and tons of group shows. But it really, that was kind of the way to get into the whole scene, right? The gallery scene, because, the stuff at the group shows would sell. And then shortly after that, I think, I believe, Gallery 1988 offered me a show, or like I think it was a 2-man show. Anyway, started small basically, and it took a long time. I think a lot of artists, younger artists, get frustrated at how, trying to break in, which I totally understand. I was there, but it just takes time, and you have to slowly build it up until, you're going from no show to 2-man show or 3-man show, and then group shows. And then finally you build your way up to like, getting your featured, I guess.
Yeah. And at this point you've shown with several galleries all over the world. But you seem to have also established a pretty strong relationship with Corey Helford in particular. Is it important to you to have that kind of strong gallery relationship? And, do you feel like that's been a necessary component?
Yeah. They've been awesome. Corey Helford has been really great. I did not used to feel that way. When I first started out, there was kind of there was the first wave of I guess lowbrow is what we called it at the time. But there was that kind of first wave of all the heavy hitters, Gary Baseman and, or he may have actually been second wave. I think I was, Camille Rose Garcia, all those guys, but to me, they were like the originals. Right. And, at that time there was a big boom in, new artists coming onto that scene. And like, I would say at that time, possibly too many artists, right? It was kind of really booming and just everybody was getting in. Some of them were great. And then there was a lot of garbage, right? But another thing that was happening at that time is that galleries were trying to get their hooks into people early. You know what I mean? And like, I think a lot of them had a goal of like finding new artists and kind of developing a stable of, this is our artist. He shows with us. Right. And at the time I thought, well, why would I want to do that? And I got offers from several different galleries to sign kind of exclusivity type contracts, but I didn't see any point in doing that. Right. I thought it would just limit me. And I think I made the right decision at that time, because then I was able to just show all over the place and get more exposure that way. But more recently, in the last decade or so, I've kind of leaned the other way, right? Like I do like showing at Corey Helford, and I I do appreciate that relationship that we've kind of built up. It's kind of been more recently. Like I've been, I've been in contact with them for many years, but it wasn't until, I don't know, the last 8 years or so that we've really started getting a more of a relationship, right? Artist to gallery relationship. And it's been great. And I've kind of been, just building that up too with them, going from, obviously I was in some group shows there. And then I got like the gallery 3, like a little side gallery. And then, the most recently, I did gallery 2, which is a little bit bigger, and right now I'm working on a show for 2026 where I will be in the main gallery.
Wow.
Now,
that's huge.
Why did I do that? Because I got to paint a lot of stuff. I got to paint so many paintings.
That's a big space.
I believe in me. I think I can do it.
Of course. Well, and it's interesting just to think about the evolution of the gallery relationship with artists. And I'm sure it's regionally different. Every kind of subculture within the different parts of the U.S. and outside of the U.S. has kind of a different vibe in terms of how galleries and their artists will work together. But I do find it super interesting that tendency in the period that you're talking about, where galleries would almost like having a stable of baseball players or whatever. It's like, you're going to sign with me and then I'm your guy and you can't work with anybody else. And like, that seems so toxic to me. Like it doesn't feel like it's supporting, like in my opinion, and this has come up a couple times on the show, galleries are most beneficial and successful when they are solely focused on improving the plight of the artist. But to me, that's not what that sounds like. That sounds like a gallery that's just in it to make money off of the backs of artists and trap them in this kind of contract.
And I think it was like that for a while. I think they were, because the field was changing, right? Like everything was changing really quickly. All these new artists were like pouring into the scene, and things were still sorting themselves out. And I'm sure some of them were just trying to make as much money as they could. I'm sure there was some manipulation and greed and stuff going on. I think some of them maybe just were looking for what is the new way of business, right? Like I think they were experimenting with things too. And things eventually just kind of settled out where it doesn't really, I think a lot of artists got caught up in that. And for some it worked great, but I think it's settled out to be more reasonable now, where it's like there's less of a kind of a manipulative atmosphere now than there was back at that time. But it all sorted itself out.
Yeah, and I mean, there's like one reason that I try to give everybody the benefit of the doubt in all of these things, but there's one reason that I could see how, like, if you do some mental gymnastics, you could get to that being an appropriate way of working, which is like, if we're going to invest time in you, then you invest time in us, and
right.
Like, why should we commit to you if you're gonna be showing with other people? Like, okay, maybe, but let's attract them with a carrot instead of the stick, like provide a good experience for them so that they want to continue to show with you instead of forcing them into a legal binding contract.
Yeah. And there is, it was manipulative, right? Like, don't get me wrong. There was, because there's a power dynamic there too, right? There's a power inequality, where they, these big awe-inspiring galleries, if you're a young artist and you've not really shown a lot, these big galleries telling you like, this is the way it is, this is how we make this arrangement. And you might be inclined to just think, well, I have to do this, right? I had the good fortune of, I was still in contact with Gary Baseman, Monty Beauchamp, from Blab, the whole Blab universe. He and I were friends. And so I had people who were able to give me advice, who kind of knew, who were at a level where they could kind of look down on this whole scene and see what was actually happening and give me advice. It still gave me a lot of anxiety. Don't get me wrong. Like, I had a lot of sleepless nights thinking like, maybe I should sign with that gallery, or I'll never have a show again, like that kind of stuff. Had a lot of conversations with artist friends, who were going through the same thing at the time, but it all worked out,
Well, it also kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about having the freedom, because you had a daily income with another source of income to pay your bills. Even though you might have had some anxiety over it, it didn't force your hand, and you had the freedom to kind of step back and wait,
That would almost be the main reason I would encourage young artists to at least consider having a real job, because it does give you a certain amount of power, right? Like I got myself into situations like that where people kind of tried to play hardball with me, and I just thought, well, I don't need you. I would love to work with you, but I don't need you. So see you later. And that all worked out too. It's like eventually the galleries started being more reasonable about that stuff. At least in my experience.
Yeah, it's good to hear that you've established some good relationships and you have a good thing going now.
Yeah, I do also do a lot of because the Blab shows, which I've got a couple of those coming up pretty soon, actually. Next weekend is the Blab show, and I've got a piece in that. But that always shows at CoPro in LA, and so I don't ever do like solo shows or anything there, but I do show there quite a bit with the group stuff.
Awesome. Very cool. Let's dive into the work itself a little bit more. And we talked earlier, about growing up, and you're like, one of your original inspirations was old Disney cartoons and like Steamboat Willie, which I was going to say, but I wanted to wait to talk to you about it till now. It's like, okay, like that obviously tracks.
Yeah.
I mean, the style is so, you could definitely see it in what you make today. But there's another aspect of it besides just the visual aesthetic that kind of ties back to that period. But in general, the subjects themselves have a very kind of children's storybook vibe. It's almost like it feels like there's several different sources of inspiration for you, but was like storybooks and old childhood books also a source of inspiration in addition to like the Steamboat Willie cartoon aesthetic?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Well, because there was a long period where, as I said, I thought I was going to be an illustrator, and I'm like a big inspiration was, the children's books were really hot back then, when I was in college or whatever. And so I was definitely inspired by stories, right? And I had thought, I'll make children's books, and that ended up not happening. But I just kind of veered off in a different direction. But Dr. Seuss is probably, if you think about it and look at my stuff, it's a very big influence. Just kind of the postures and attitudes and just the silliness of it. I do paint a lot of lumpy things that I look at and think, that must have come from Dr. Seuss. That was definitely, for sure, I would say. Do you remember a children's book called The Stinky Cheese Man?
No, but that sounds amazing.
It was amazing.
It sounds like something off of like Ren and Stimpy.
Oh, well, speaking of another influence, I think emotionally, Ren and Stimpy did influenced me at just how ridiculous it was, how every moment was so dramatic. Just the most mundane thing would be so dramatic, and how angry they would get. And I think I internalized a lot of that, like really extreme emotions. When I started out, part of my style was sad things, right? I've since kind of evolved away from only sad things, but a lot of that, like those facial expressions, were definitely influenced by, Stimpy getting upset about. Or wait, Ren was the Chihuahua, right? Yeah. Ren, he was the main one. He would get really upset about
so
things.
So angry all the time.
Yeah.
Well, so you mentioned of Stinky Cheese Man, and what was the toast guy on Ren and Stimpy? Like Powdered Toast Man? Oh, Powdered Toast Man. Yeah. So when you said Stinky Cheese Man, that's the first thing that came to mind.
Yep. I think that was all just in the air back then, like that kind of silly stuff. But all of that was, big influence. I also get, I don't know, I I have a lot of separate influences. Obviously a lot of cartoons. I mentioned Steamboat Willie, but like all the Max Fleischer stuff, Betty Boop, all of that era of stuff. Dr. Seuss, obviously. But I also, I do get a lot of inspiration from, because when I started out, I didn't know how to paint a background. I could do characters, but I had no idea, like, I just hadn't practiced arranging space and stuff. So I would cheat and I would go look at like old early Renaissance paintings or whatever and I'd just pull elements out of it or arrangements, So I actually get a lot of inspiration from that too. And one thing I do like to do, which I'm doing a little bit of right now, is taking like classical subjects, but doing them in my style, improving them. Because the old classical stuff, boring, but take away the elbows. Now it's fun. It's great.
Well, and another thing that I think is striking to me, just having looked at your, body of work and preparing for the show and just having been familiar with your work for a while, is how everything appears like it's coming from the same world. Almost like these are little vignettes of different events in this universe that you've been creating. And is that how you look at it as well? Do you feel like you're contributing to like a larger world, or is that not as important to you and these are just like one scene is the whole scene and that's all that matters?
That is a good question. There definitely is a universe, right? But it's I think, okay, there's a couple of different ways you can go when you're establishing yourself, right? You can paint the same thing over and over, or variations on the same thing over and over. Or what I tried to do is, I think I was pretty intentional about that. I was trying to create a stable of different characters that I could use so that I could tell different stories and that I wouldn't be locked into just painting one thing, right? Luke Chu, a good friend of mine, paints the bears. He's so awesome.
Yeah.
But, people, and he's branched out a little bit from that, but people, that's what they want him to paint the bears. And so he has in the past, I know, had some trouble like getting away from that at all. But the path that I chose was more like, okay. And I think it was influenced a lot by that first show I told you about I did with Ryan, where we were creating this, this fictional old cartoon company. But it got me in the mindset of like, well, I'll make different characters. Like I've got my woodsman and my trees, like they live over here. I've got like some weird man made out of smoke and he's like an evil character. You know what I mean? And so that was more my approach, to just create different characters that I could. And then from there, for me, it's really just, I think it holds together because it's all coming out of my head. You know what I mean?
Right.
But yeah, I feel like I made the right decision on that. Just to give myself a little bit of freedom. Yeah.
So do those characters represent certain things? Like when you're using the woodsman, does it always mean this? Or do you kind of interchange them with different attitudes and characteristics? And it's more just a visual language, I guess.
It's really just a visual. It's just kind of the characters will adapt themselves to whatever I'm feeling like at the moment, right? And I also like not assigning them a strict meaning, because number one, they don't have a strict meaning, except in maybe a very specific circumstance. Like, but then I like to take what they represent and kind of flip it around, right? For example, a big one that I do that I enjoy painting is my woodsman and the trees. But sometimes the trees are the good guys, and the woodsmen are these horrible, like, probably influenced by, I don't know. I experienced some frustrations with like big corporations and, just big business and people going to war for oil and stuff and things that would get me frustrated. And at that time I might do a painting where the woodsmen represent kind of that kind of feeling, right? And then the trees are like the victims. But then I would take the same thing and flip it around. Sometimes the trees are evil, and it's a story we're telling ourselves about how killing the trees that's necessary because they're bad. They're clearly bad. I mean, look at them.
Right.
But I do like to not have a very specific meaning that I always have to be painting to.
Yeah.
And I also like to keep it open for interpretation. I don't like to over-explain what mainly I'm just trying to make people laugh, honestly. When I paint, I usually settle on something that just I think is funny. And it may have a meaning and it might not. It might look like it has a meaning and doesn't, or it might not look like it has a meaning and actually does have a meaning, But I think it's better to keep it open like that for the viewers too, or, whoever's consuming it, because if you have a little bit of mystery or something about it that you don't quite understand what it's trying to say or do, it makes it more interesting to me.
Yeah. But it also, even beyond that, it leaves it like that open-endedness allows people to relate to it in their own way. Bring it into their life. Yeah, exactly. So like if you may have a meaning when you created it, but if you're not super specific about what that meaning should be, then it doesn't like box people into that experience and allows them to apply it in their own life the way they want to,
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's cool.
I would say there's a lot of cynicism in my paintings.
I wasn't gonna say cynicism, but like political undertones, or like there's hidden meaning. It sounds like in there as well.
Kind of. I mean, they're only insofar. I have never painted something with a distinct political message. Right? I don't do that. I don't really have an interest in that. But I'm positive that paintings have been influenced by how I felt about just the way the world was going at the time, So in that sense, I guess they are, but they're not designed to be telling a story about politics or anything like that. So
are they meant to tell a story though? I guess that's the other kind of overarching question is, do you feel that they're narrative in a way? Do you want them to kind of communicate a story? Even if it's not like super specific, the message, do you like to tell stories through your art?
Yeah, for sure. I would say for sure, but I think I approach it in more of a kind of an episodic fashion, right? Like old cartoons, right? Where you might see some character, behaving one way in a cartoon, and then the next cartoon they're in the Wild West, and it's the same character, but they're just acting like a player on a stage, right? They're just performing a role.
I mean, Looney Tunes were like that a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess as they matured, they started to kind of develop their own consistency. But in the early days, they were all just players that interchanged in these old stories,
Yeah. And I think that's kind of the approach I take. They're just tools to use, I still once in a while will try to introduce a new character, but then you wonder how many is too many. Come on. But that's why that's the genius of the nose that I knew from the very beginning. As long as you got that nose on there, that's me. I did it, right?
Yeah. And no elbows. It can't have elbows.
And no elbows.
So how do you generally arrive at your ideas for new works? Like, what's your approach to ideation? Do you have like a regular daily like sketch routine, or have any kind of like dedicated brainstorming activities?
No. Remember at the very beginning when I said that I'll sketch for 5 minutes and get bored? I'm still that way. So I really have to just let things percolate like in the back of my mind. And I'll, if I've got a show coming up, I'll just think kind of casually about it, and I'll maybe sit down and draw something that I think is funny. And then I'll just kind of build it out from there. But it's almost never that I know exactly what a show is going to be, and I sketch it out all in one go. Although sometimes I'll get large portions of it. Like I'll kind of get a general theme that I want to do. Like a couple shows ago, I did kind of a very loose fortune telling theme, right? And so everything, at least tangentially, would kind of connect to that. Like I designed a bunch of what looked like little tarot cards, images almost, but it's loose, right? Because it's eclectic, right? I'm just kind of throwing things in that I think are funny, and that's how I decide what I'm going to be painting, is when things make me laugh, or I think they just present a a weird viewpoint that makes you makes you think. And that's usually I gravitate towards that stuff. So,
and once you have like an idea that you want to kind of develop even more, how do you go from idea to painting? Do you go through a series of sketches and build out the composition that way, or do you kind of just jump right into painting?
No, I will once I have a thought of what I want to do, I'll spend some time sketching out, aesthetically how I want it to look. And I almost never get it the first try. So I do have to, refine. I usually the concept is usually solid, but I will mess for, a half a day on sketches, just trying to get everything arranged how I want it. But then from that point, once I start painting, it's pretty quick, right? Like once I've got it kind of planned out, I get impatient. So I never fully plan it out, which I also think maybe is a good thing. I'll get just to the point where I'm impatient enough that I got to start now. Then I'll start painting, and then I'll figure out other details, even at the end of the painting, like, I don't know, some detail in the background that makes it all feel like a story that wasn't necessarily there when I started. It was just an image of a character or whatever. But then I'll paint like 2 brontosauruses fighting in the background, like really small. It's like, what does that mean? I don't know. Where are we?
Yeah.
What's happening?
Not only do you make paintings, sculptures, toys, all of these things that come out of your personal practice, but you've also done several concert posters over the years, from Pussifer to Primus to, I think you did several on Tool's concert tour last year. So how did you get started making posters for bands and concerts?
I think I just got emails from people asking me if I wanted to do a poster, right? I think just people who had seen my work and thought, oh, that would be fun for a poster. The Tool ones were, I think, really there was a big party in 2009 at Corey Helford, actually, but it was in their old space, and they were getting ready to leave that space, and they were having one big last show. And I got invited to the party for that show, and it was going to be like 100 artists just all hanging out. This is all leading somewhere, to answer your question. But basically what happened was, through some sort of miscommunication or misunderstanding, I didn't get invited to be in the show. So I didn't have a piece in the show, but I got invited to the party, and I was like, this is super weird that I wasn't asked to be in the show, but I am going to that party.
Sure.
And so I traveled out to LA, went to this party, and it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, right? Just from they say don't meet your heroes or whatever, but I met a bunch of my heroes that night, and it was awesome. I met Camille Rose Garcia that night. She was so nice. And, I was kind of starstruck by all these fantastic artists that, I had only just been seeing their work in magazines and whatnot. And now I was out there hanging out with them, and it was awkward because they were like, oh, what's your piece in the show? And I was like, oh, I don't have one. I just came to the party. But it was invaluable, that whole thing. One of the people I met at that party was, I do this thing. I have a thing with names, and they go out of my head. The guitarist for Tool.
Adam Jones?
Adam Jones. Yes. I almost said the wrong name, and I was like, no, that's not. Yeah, Adam Jones. Jiminy Crickets. Anyways, I met him that night too. Super nice guy. And yeah, so then I just kind of background knew him, right? And he's bought some pieces of mine over the years, I think. And then when it came time for that tour, I think he was just looking to try something new, and he was because they had a very distinct style for like Tool stuff, kind of mystical, demony, great stuff. Right. But I think he just wanted to try a new tack on that, and so he got a bunch of the people that I met that night at that party contributed art for those posters, and he asked me to do one, and I was thrilled to do that. Yeah, I really enjoyed doing the posters. It's
amazing.
Fun.
Yeah, I remember distinctively that when, and I don't know if it was, I think it was earlier than last year. I think it might have been the year before, but there was definitely like a noticeable shift in the style of posters that they were putting out, all drawing artists from this kind of Southern California and just general, new contemporary art community of artists that I guess Adam's, friends with. So really cool.
And that's what it came down to. I think it was just friends of his, and he's got a lot of talented friends.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so like barring that, having that direct connection with Adam, other projects like Primus and Pussifer, how do those projects generally come to you? Is it directly or through like a PR agency or?
No, just I got an email from the guy who was kind of organizing those poster runs. His name is Z. There may be more to it, but I'm forgetting. But basically, he would organize, gather up the artists for these shows, and yeah, I think I just got an email one day saying, "Would you like to do a Primus poster?" And I was like, "Who wouldn't like to do a Primus poster?" Yes, thank you very much. I would love to. So that was great. That was really fun.
Are these generally like new images that you create specifically for that event, or are they stuff that you've created just in your own personal work that you've repurposed for the poster?
Usually they are images that I create specifically for the poster. This last round of Tool posters, the 3 that I did for the last US thing, those were pre-existing pieces. But everything else, I think, before that, and I think that a lot of that was just because there wasn't a lot of time. There was no way I was going to be able to do 3 posters, from scratch or whatever. Because I was also, I think, painting for my last show at Corey Helford at that time too. So those ones were pre-existing, but it was artwork that otherwise was kind of unassigned, right? They were just cool paintings that I'd done or that I liked, and they just happened to fit. Yeah, normally it's coming up with a concept and painting it.
Very cool. And so, you mentioned your last show, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier. I wanted to talk with you a little bit about that before we talk about what you have coming up. It was called Small Time Buffoonist. It opened in April at Corey Helford, and actually I got a chance to see it before it closed.
Oh, sweet.
I happened to be in LA for Esau's opening the same weekend that was the last weekend of your show. Yeah. And so like I was just going around to all the galleries, because it's the first time I'd been in LA since 2015. And yeah, your show happened to be showing while I was there. So incredible. It's not often that I actually get to see artists' work that like in person that talk to. So like it was a rare experience for me. So yeah, great show. I actually live streamed some of it on my Instagram. Like I went through the whole gallery. But tell me about that body of work. Like, was there an overarching theme for that one? We talked a little bit about your show with Ryan Heschke, where you kind of developed this concept in advance and worked, towards that end. Was it the same type of thing for this show?
It was not. When I was painting for that show, it ended up being way more eclectic than normal. And, why that is, I do remember when I was painting for that show, I was having a really hard time mentally just getting my mind around what I wanted to do. And I kept changing my mind. But the clock is ticking, right? Like you've got to, you got to turn out some work. So I found for that show specifically, I thought, you know what, this show, and Small Time Buffoonist, the title is it's just kind of generic, right? It's just a silly bunch of words together. And that's really just because there was no real theme to that show. It was really just funny thoughts that I had, and it all hangs together, I guess, just from the colors and the style and all that. But I wouldn't say that it had a very strong theme. The one I'm painting now for 2026, I do have more of a theme for, which I cannot reveal to you at this time. It's a secret. But and usually I will have at least a loose theme, but every once in a while, I think that's one good thing about my style is that I can just not have a theme and it still works out okay. You know what I mean?
There's enough consistency, and that's interesting to hear that your next show is going to have one, considering it's such a large show. Like having that many pieces have to all kind of work together towards a theme. Like I can only imagine the challenge that that's going to be.
I think it would be more accurate to say that there will be 2 or 3 mini themes within it, right? So I imagine that the big body of work, which I've mostly kind of planned out, will all be kind of one theme, but I might have like little sub shows, as sometimes people do, right? In those big shows, they'll have like a little section that's, 5 pieces that all kind of that show like chapeau fashion, world chapeau fashion, like whatever. So it'll be kind of structured like that, I think.
Okay. And with that last show and with this next show coming up, do you generally decide ahead of time that you're going to have some number of sculpted pieces, or is it something you kind of figure out as you're developing the paintings? You're like, oh, that would actually be good to be accompanied with a sculpted piece.
That's a great question. I usually come up with the sculpture stuff first. Okay. That's, for whatever reason, that's the stuff I get the most excited about. I think because I like building it, like I like figuring out how I'm going to build this thing out of wood or epoxy resin or whatever it is I'm working with. The funny thing about the question is I have a certain number of hanging pieces that I have to do in order to fill up the space, right? Sure. And we before every show, you have an in-depth discussion with the gallery about like what they're expecting and roughly how many pieces you're going to need and what rough sizes they'll need to be. Well, the sculptural pieces don't count towards the number of pieces for that reason, right? Because they're not taking up wall space. So they're all kind of extra, right? There's stuff I know I'm going to do, and there's no way I would have a show without sculptural stuff. But I got to do the paintings first. So we'll see. I got to do a lot of paintings. We'll see how much time I have left for sculptural stuff. But I have some big plans.
Like when you're deciding on what's going to make the sculpted treatment, like are there certain characters in your lineup, in your repertoire that you tend to lean more towards, like this is actually a better character to do as a sculpture? Or like what is it about your characters, like the characteristics of them in particular, that make them good for sculpted works?
I mean, all of my stuff is pretty geometric, right? In assembly, like my woodsman guys, they're just a bunch of balls stuck together with some with some wires coming off of it. They're all pretty easy, I would say. But honestly, the sculptures I don't necessarily have any favorites that I like to do specifically as sculptures. Those tend to be, they could be anything, right? Like a couple of shows ago, I did this bunny, which was not one of my characters. It was just a bunny kind of running along. And it was honestly just it was a piece of epoxy resin that I had started sculpting probably 7 years before and then gave up on. And then as the show was approaching, I thought, oh, I could finish that and that could be a piece. So I just made it into a rabbit and ta-da, there you go. So I don't plan it out so much in that way. It's more just what's inspired me, and then I'll make something funny out of that.
Awesome. So other than your next show in 2026, anything else coming up that you want to put on people's radars? Print releases, any other events?
Yeah, well, coming up right away, September 7th is the Blab show. I'm going to have a piece in that. I'm not going out for the show. I'm not able to. Ironically, actually, I'm going to be in LA, and then I'm flying back the day before the show, and then I'm flying back out to LA the day after the show. It's weird.
Wow.
But there's that coming up. That's always a great show. I'm just looking at what my shows are here. There's a Krampus show that's also affiliated with Blab that's coming up in November. No, that's in December, the Blab Krampus show. And that'll be at CoPro also. And then I am going to have a piece in the Don't Wake Daddy show over in Amsterdam. I think it's Amsterdam. Yeah, that's in November. And then there's a group show coming up in next April. That's a beautiful, bizarre show. So
awesome.
Yeah, a couple of group things. I like to do that just to kind of stay doing something while I'm working up for my, to my show.
Very cool. So where can people find you online so they can keep up with all these things you got coming up?
TravisLampe.com, all one word. You can go there. Although I haven't updated my website since 2011, and I probably won't ever.
It still says copyright 2010. It still says, I think.
Yeah, totally. It's just, that's laziness. That's just laziness. Well, part of it is if, fixing my website means taking time away from painting, and I don't have time to do that right now. So there you go. But there's, my shop. You can access my shop through there. And then on Instagram, I'm Travis Lampe, all one word, on Instagram also. And that's mainly where I show up.
Okay. Last question, and this is something that I like to ask everybody. Who is one artist that you'd like to see me have on the show?
Ooh. Wow. Somebody that you haven't already had?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's like assumed, but yeah.
Gosh. I mean, the first person that jumps... Have you had Ryan on the show?
No,
Ryan
no,
Heshka? Ryan Heshka.
There we go.
That's your guy. Yeah. He's one of my favorites. He's first of all, he's a good friend, and I love his style. He constantly amazes me. He's got a lot more... he's more technically skilled than I am. Let's put it that way. So I look up to him.
Awesome. Yeah, you said that earlier. That was the second time you said that. So hopefully it doesn't get to his head.
Yeah, no, it has. Oh, that guy. You can hardly be around him. No, he's Canadian, so he's super nice, as they all are. Ryan Heshka. Go
awesome.
Get that guy.
Great choice. Well, Travis, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And thanks for, kind of moving things around to accommodate. I really appreciate that.
So that's it for this episode of Art Affairs. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Travis. It was super interesting to hear Travis's experience doing corporate advertising and how he ultimately made the transition to focus on his personal work more. It wasn't a fast transition, though. It sounds like it played out over the course of 6 or 7 years. But when he ultimately started showing, it snowballed pretty quickly. I was also really interested to hear how his relationship with galleries had changed over the years. The early parts of his career, he hit up against galleries that wanted to lock him into some long-term exclusive contracts, which understandably felt super manipulative. But now he really hasn't encountered that as much anymore. So that's definitely changed throughout the course of his career. I do wonder if it's the atmosphere itself that has changed, or if it's just he's become a more prominent artist and those types of galleries don't approach him anymore. So it's an interesting thing to maybe inspect a little bit more. But even in the early part of his career, he was able to avoid getting tied up in all of that because of the freedom that having his day job in advertising provided him. And again, that's developed into a pretty solid recurring theme of the show, how having a day job to go with your personal creative practice can be exhausting, depending on the kind of work that you do, but can also provide all kinds of additional benefits for your personal art practice. And he was able to, say no to these toxic relationships precisely because he didn't have to worry about, where his next paycheck was going to come from. And with Travis's situation specifically, it seems like the arrangement has worked out really well. With him doing freelance work, he can increase or decrease his day job workload based on how much time he wants to spend on his personal work. So he isn't having to, put in such crazy hours working essentially two full-time jobs. It's exciting to hear about this huge show that he's already started working for that's penciled in for 2026 at Corey Helford. Their Gallery 1 space is enormous, so it sounds like he's spending the next 1.5 to 2 years creating a body of work that'll fill that space. Not to mention the, quote-unquote extra sculpted pieces that he'll inevitably create. And speaking of, just as an aside, I'd prepared to dive a whole lot deeper into that side of his art practice and, talk with him more about his sculpted works and his experience making designer toys. But we ended up running out of time. But it does sound like he's anticipating that there will be at least some sculpted pieces for this 2026 show, but TBD on how many and how big they'll be. I'll also be interested to see what those multi-sub-themes that he talked about are going to be for the show and how they sort of combine to create this larger overarching theme. Will it be one big anthology piece consisting of a handful of smaller, short stories? Or, it'll be fascinating to see how that all comes together. Follow his Instagram to find out more about the show as it develops and about all the other group shows that he's participating in this year and next. So thanks again to Travis for joining me today, and thank you for checking out the show. I'm truly grateful for your support. And just a reminder, one big way you could help out if you're really enjoying the show would be to check out the show's Patreon. You can find all the details on patreon.com/artaffairs. And as always, you can contact me through my website at artaffairespodcast.com or on Instagram at artaffairespodcast. So until next time, be good to yourself and be good to each other.
That's all, folks.